Okay, Crim 1, here we go with Chapter 13, which is Community Corrections. And if you'll remember the last chapter, Chapter 12, we went over institutional corrections. So that's jails and prisons, places where people are actually in custody as they serve their sentence and rehabilitate. Community corrections is, oh, come on, there we go. Court-imposed programs and sanctions that allow offenders to serve their sentences within the community instead of in jail or prison. So these are people who are sometimes on probation, sometimes on parole. Sometimes they're just ordered to do things by the court without a lot of supervision. Things like pay fines, attend a class, things like that. There are a lot of pros and cons, but we'll talk about the pros, positive things about community corrections. How does it benefit people? Well, kind of a lot of different ways. First and foremost, community corrections helps to ease the overcrowding issues in our correctional facilities like jails and prisons. Obviously, we're very aware, I'm sure, that a lot of our jails and prisons, certainly in California, are overcrowded. So that is definitely one huge benefit. It's also much less expensive to supervise someone in their home, in their own home that they're paying for, as opposed to inside a jail or prison. They don't have to pay for their food, they don't have to pay for their shelter, they don't have to pay for their medical care, all that kind of stuff if this person is under the supervision of community corrections. Another bonus is that offenders who are working and under the supervision of community corrections get to keep their jobs. They get to keep supporting themselves and their families. That's another bonus. And then finally, think about the family unit. Does it benefit children to have their parents in custody? And I'm going to say the answer is probably no, depending on who the parent is. Some parents are horrible human beings and they need to be in custody. But some of them, just made a bad mistake, or not even, made a mistake, and losing those relationships that they have with their children can be pretty significant in the child's future and the offender's, the offender's future. So those are just some of the benefits to community corrections. So drawbacks would be the potential for these offenders to offend again while they are on community corrections or under the supervision of community corrections and create more victims. So, and that's huge. So the pros and cons, it probably depends on who you are as to what you think about what outweighs what. So I worked in probation for, like I said, about 20 years. It's an alternative to jail or prison where the offender is supervised by a probation officer who is an officer of the court. What happens with probation is generally a judge will make an order indicating an offender is going to be placed on probation instead of being placed in custody. And the judge will order numerous terms and conditions that offender must live by in order to remain out of custody. So things like obey all laws, let the PO know your new address if you move within 48 hours, report to the probation officer when notified, maybe attend substance abuse treatment, maybe maintain employment. There's a bunch of different things that could be ordered by the court in order for the person to remain out of custody. What are the goals? Usually rehabilitation and public safety. So yeah, it's pretty tough sometimes to balance those two. Public safety is pretty important, but the goal is really to rehabilitate the offender or make the offender stop offending. So these are just some regular old traditional terms or conditions of probation. So that would be report to probation on a regular basis, maintain employment or attend school, obey all law. Oh, I already mentioned all these, huh? And then the bottom one is one I haven't mentioned, and it just kind of depends on who the offender is and what the offense is. If the offender who's on probation is a known gang member, then they're probably going to be ordered not to associate with known criminals or other gang members. So these conditions can vary based on what type of offense the offender has committed, and their gang involvement, things like that. So these are just traditional terms of probation. Who is on probation? This is a breakdown: 25% women, 75% men, 55% white, 28% black, 14% Latino, and 3% other. So this is a nationwide breakdown. If we were looking at Fresno County, it might look a little bit different. We have a much larger Latino population in Fresno County. So our numbers of Latinos that are on probation is probably going to be a little bit higher in Fresno County. What is the probation officer's role? First and foremost, they are required to prepare reports for the court. Usually it starts with those pre-sentence investigation reports, where the probation officer writes a report after there is a conviction or a guilty plea in a case, and that report will be kind of a guideline and recommendation for the court for sentencing purposes. They supervise offenders next. And by supervise, this usually means meet with offenders every so often. For juveniles, we would have to meet once a month. For adults, there are no actual mandates about how many times they have to meet with a probation officer, but usually the officers will have their a regular schedule of appointments. The probation officer has to assure that court orders are being carried out. So I was basically like a second, third, fourth, whatever mom to most of my offenders to make sure, did you do this? Did you do that? Did you do this? Are you not doing this? Show me proof that you're in school. Show me proof that you're working. Here's a drug test, things like that. So we have to we would have to follow through with all the court orders. Assist in rehabilitation. This is usually by way of making referrals. If an offender is a drug addict, for example, I would refer them to maybe a substance abuse treatment program in order to assist in their rehabilitation. That's just an example. And then protect the community. So if you have a violent offender who is continuing to be violent while they're out on probation, it is the responsibility of that officer to bring the offender back to the court and let the court make a decision on what to do. Parole. Parole and probation, a lot of people think those are the same things. They are not. So I'm going to go back here real quick. Probation is a sentence. It is a sentence handed down by a judge. Okay, so probation is a sentence handed down by a judge. Okay, I'm going to skip forward here back to parole. Parole is an early release from prison, which is done by a parole board. Okay, so I want to make sure we remember, if you have been to prison, you are a convicted felon. Prison is a state or federal facility for convicted felons only. So if you are on parole, you have been released from prison early by a parole board. It really has nothing to do with the judge. So that's really where the main difference is with probation and parole, how a person gets to one or the other. Terms and conditions of probation and parole are usually pretty similar. If you're on parole, you probably have to be employed. You have to obey all laws. You have to attend treatment programs. You have to report your address, all that kind of stuff. So it gets pretty similar once we get past the how did the offender get there. Okay. A parole board is a group of people authorized by law to grant permission for selected offenders after they serve a certain portion of their time to be released into the community. They get to finish their sentence in the community. There are a couple of different types of release from prison. A mandatory release is when an offender has literally timed out. Let's say they were sentenced to prison for 8 years. They served 8 years and had to be released because there was no time left. That is a mandatory release. A discretionary release is when a person is released on parole. because they still have some time left hanging over their head. If they mess up, they can be sent back to prison. But discretionary parole is when that parole board looks at their case and says, okay, you know what, we think that you're ready to be released under the supervision of a parole agent. And then we have this thing in California, which to me personally, kind of frustrating, but it's called non-revocable parole. That means that the parole agent is not allowed to violate or book the arrest, I should say, the offender for simply a violation of parole, which seems kind of silly. Why be on parole? Probably for search and seizure purposes. Most people on probation or parole are subject to search and seizure by any peace officer at any time, with or without a warrant. So, non-revocable parole. It was a nightmare for me, but anyways, moving on. Then we have a bunch of other called intermediate sanctions. These are sanctions between most of them are out of custody, and they are I want to say lower level offense, levels of supervision. So they're less than being in custody. So diversion. There are many different types of diversion programs. One, just for example, would be something like a drug court. Now, how a drug court works by way of an offender gets arrested, contacted by law enforcement for using or possessing drugs. If it's their first offense, a lot of times they can go to a drug court program where they go to court maybe once a month for 6 months. And during those 6 months, they drug test regularly and they attend a substance abuse treatment program. If they comply and they have all clean tests and they attend all of their substance abuse treatment, their case will get dismissed and sealed like it never happened at the 6-month mark. There's people yelling outside my door. I'm in my office. Sorry, hopefully that's not coming over the recording. Secondly, community service. Most of you know what community service is. You are, generally speaking, working for a nonprofit agency and not getting paid for it. So this could be somebody working for the Salvation Army. You could be working for who else? The Fresno Bully Rescue. That's where I volunteer. Anyways, restorative justice is a program which I think we might have talked about before, but I'll say it again. Restorative justice is a program where the victim and the offender get together with a mediator and they resolve the issues relating the crime without court involvement. So let's say, for example, somebody smashed my car window while I was at home, and the police contacted that person, and that person had no prior legal contacts. So the officer will ask the suspect, hey, do you want to resolve this informally through restorative justice? And if the offender says yes, and the victim says yes, that'd be me, then we would schedule a date and time to meet with a mediator, and I would get to tell the offender what it felt like when he smashed my car window in, and he would get a chance to tell me why he did it and apologize. And then the mediator will look at me and say, what can he do, meaning the suspect, do to make you whole again? And I'll say I want my window paid for and I want an apology letter. And he'll look at the suspect and say, can you pay for the window and do an apology letter? And the suspect would say, yep. And once they pay for my window and write my apology letter, the case is dismissed and sealed like it never happened. Restitution. I say it funny because retribution and restitution sound very similar. But restitution is money paid to a victim to make them whole again. So even in the example I just used, if someone had smashed my car window, restitution would be money paid to me by the suspect to fix my window. Okay, so make me whole again. Fines are also quite frequently imposed when a person goes through the court process. Generally speaking, a lot of those fines are going to go to victim, what are they called? Victim compensation funds. Whew, took me a minute there. Victim compensation funds. So if you commit a misdemeanor, it's very likely, no matter what the misdemeanor is, you're going to have to pay a fine. And that is just money that you're paying into the victim compensation fund. So yeah, it kind of depends on the nature of the crime as to how much the fines can be. Forfeiture. This is an interesting one. Forfeiture is when a piece of property, vehicle, any item is purchased with illegal money. Maybe the owner was a money launderer. Maybe they got all their money from selling drugs, and the courts and law enforcement can prove that the whatever the item is. Let's say we'll just use a car for an example. A drug dealer has a Maserati. Okay, the drug dealer only has a Maserati because he bought the Maserati with drug money. So if they can prove that that Maserati was purchased with drug money, then the law enforcement agency gets to take that car. I know, it's crazy, right? The money is usually split up between multiple agencies, but that money has to go towards certain things. They can't just, go buy a new bar to put in their police station, stuff like that. It has to be a valid purchase. Shock probation. This is when we strap up an offender and we put an electric shock on them. No, I'm just joking. I'm joking. That's not funny, and I'm joking. Okay, shock probation is basically when an offender who is on probation and is having some issues with compliance gets put back into custody for a few days, maybe 5 days, maybe 10 days, something like that. And the goal is to kind of shock them back into like, oh, hey, if I keep messing up, I'm going to end up back in custody. GPS supervision, as you can imagine, that's when a person has a GPS tracker on their ankle and they are their whereabouts is known to the probation officer at all times. And then they have work release. This is really interesting. Some people go to jail only on the weekends, or they go to jail and then at 8 o'clock in the morning they're allowed to go to work, and then at 5 o'clock in the afternoon they have to come back. Interesting, huh? So that's a work release type program. Or some people, like I said, are allowed to stay out of custody and they have to serve their jail time just on the weekends. So I think that's it. That is it for